And the first topic we really would like to talk about is about the why behind Kubernetes. And it's probably a kind of an obvious answer at first, but what was really interesting, Hyman, is to understand, okay, we've seen this movement now for a couple years going on. What are kind of the main drivers, if you need to answer that today, that companies would go into the Kubernetes journey?
Yeah, so first of all, there's the most obvious one, that people started using Kubernetes because Kubernetes is simply is a container orchestrator. So if you're a company running a lot of containers, you'll have to choose between either a cloud container solution or Kubernetes. So container orchestration is one way of, one reason why companies choose for Kubernetes. But I think in general, I think Kubernetes is way more than just a container orchestrator. I think Nathan Yellin mentioned a while back that Kubernetes is the operating system of the cloud.
Who is that? Who's Nathan?
That's the founder of Robust.dev, a good point. He mentioned that, he had a good comparison between an operating system and Kubernetes, and that is actually the modern operating system of the cloud, which is really interesting to look for, to look at, because the ecosystem, the CNCF ecosystem around Kubernetes is open. So all these technologies are open, and vendor lock-in is of course a big reason for companies not to go for proprietary solution, but to choose for Kubernetes. And Kubernetes is a framework. Yeah. You can plug in and plug out your tools that you want, and that makes it sort of, from an architectural perspective, also that you don't have an architectural lock-in. Because a lot of people think about vendor lock-ins, but architectural lock-in is dangerous too. Yeah. So whenever you're in a certain architecture, it's not that easy to get out of it. And Kubernetes gives you the opportunity to be open in that way. And it's the most used container orchestration at this time. Yeah.
So just to allude to that, so what we see happening at a lot of our customers, it becomes so easy to just drop and replace a particular piece of technology, because we're standardizing on input and output, and a monitoring tool or a message queue or whatever, metric storage, right? All of it is standardizing, and also due to that underlying layer. So for companies, it's much easier to experiment with a particular technology, decide if it works, if not. And if you compare it with years before the entire cloud native movement, or even before the standardization around Kubernetes, that simply was much more difficult to do.
Exactly, yeah. And also some companies do it for cutting down costs. Because what you see, for example, if you use container instances in Azure, or if you use managed services by the cloud, of course that's their business model. The business model of the cloud is to make money with managed services. And Kubernetes sort of makes it possible to have multiple clusters at different clouds and make the clouds compete with each other. Yeah. And with projects like Cilium, where you can actually have networking connectivity between different clusters in different clouds. Yeah. In the future, we're going to see a lot more of that, I believe. Yeah.
Hey, and that's a promise I've heard many times, that you can go from one cloud to the other. So I see a lot of customers using multiple clouds at the same time, but I do see very limited number of companies really moving their workloads from one to the other almost at real time. Do you see similar patterns? So an app simply runs fixed in this cloud for a couple years. It's not that next month it runs in the other and back.
No, generally not. So if you use multiple clouds, there's a cost involved. So in order to do that, because you want to mitigate your vendor lock-in issues, you have to pay for that. Yeah. Different clouds, the integration between clouds is not easy. Yeah. So in general, for most companies, I would advise to just use one cloud, run Kubernetes on top of it. And if it really gets out of hand, or your cloud goes bankrupt or something happens, move to another cloud. Yeah. But at least with Kubernetes, that's an option. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, the question was, what are kind of the main reasons to go for Kubernetes? You've mentioned it becomes the containerization layer or the OS of the cloud. You've mentioned the open architecture, the cost. Are there another 2-3 reasons that you see currently happening why moving there?
Yeah, maybe a less obvious one might be if a company is running completely on-premise. I've seen this in an example at a company I was doing consulting for, that legally they couldn't go to cloud just because of contracts with clients. Their data had to be in the data center at the client location. So in that case, cloud is just not an option, at least not for production data. And for those companies, it can be really helpful for developers to have a modern stack, a Kubernetes stack, on top of an on-premise infrastructure.
Yeah. So exactly. Yeah. So whether or not you're allowed to go to a public cloud is no longer a reason to not use cloud native technologies,
Exactly.
right? So with the arrival of professional Kubernetes, if you like, we've split, right, the close relationship between only in public cloud you can benefit from public cloud or cloud native capabilities.
Yeah.
With Kubernetes, that's everywhere, right?
Exactly,
Even
and
in
the developer
edge.
experience. That's the nice thing about the developer experience with Kubernetes. The Kubernetes API is their experience, so they only talk to a Kubernetes API. And if they work for a public cloud company or a private cloud, it's all the same.
Yeah.
So their experience will be the same.
Yeah, really good to hear.
Yeah.
Hey, before we go deeper into Kubernetes, what would be really nice to understand as well is what are actually the broader practices that companies need to apply when using Kubernetes. And we've touched upon the CNCF landscape. I do know by heart that there are not only monitoring and observability tools in there or OS oriented, but a lot more. My question would be is, hey, what are the other kind of bigger areas you need to pay attention to when you go into a Kubernetes professional at scale type of setup?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about that later, of course, in a bit more detail. But in general, when you implement a Kubernetes stack, you're implementing a new stack. So you'll have to do, usually it comes with a cloud migration or restructuring of your CI/CD pipelines. Maybe you'll have a monolith and you want to migrate your monolith to microservices slowly, creating multiple microservices of your monolith. All those things are, pretty big things that you need to think about when you change your architecture to Kubernetes. Yeah. So
it's actually the full. So you mentioned it's the full spectrum of software development, right? CI/CD, and then I can imagine at least what I see is a lot of security involved as well, building professional pipelines with container scanning and all these type of practices. But you also mentioned it's also the re-architecture of your application itself. Right? We've seen the big lift and shift move, but you're actually saying to really benefit from Kubernetes, hey, pay attention to your architecture. And
exactly. Yeah. And that's a really big point, because if you're running a monolith with a database inside and a lot of stateful stuff, that technically runs on Kubernetes, but you won't get all the benefits.
Exactly. Yeah.
So in that case, you might. It's better to just change your services in a way that Kubernetes supports into a modern architecture. So, for example, the 12-factor app is a good example to look at, where you can see if your application is actually like it should for a cloud-native environment, because legacy applications are not necessarily good fit for cloud-native environments.
Yeah, definitely. Also something to check out, 12-factor app. You'll definitely find that if you Google that, and will be most likely the first result that you see. Hey. So business reasons surrounding practices that need to change as well. And then there's one question, right? How do you communicate the benefits of going into Kubernetes? Because what I see, honestly, is it's often driven from a more technical desire, right? Or engineers push it, or SREs or platform teams. And often still seen as, hey, it's a big investment, we need to re-architecture. Is it really worth spending so much time and effort to actually make that migration and that jump forward? How would you advise people who join this webinar that they should communicate the benefits and the values that a Kubernetes platform would bring to them?
Yeah, I think if you implement a stack correctly, and we're going to talk about it a little bit later, of course, because you wanted to know a little bit more about the good architecture and what that looks like. If you set it up correctly, then developers are really focused on business. And I think that's also the thing we're saying at PioNative. Our main goal is for developers to be able to focus on their business and focus on development. And if you switch to a DevOps-like environment, so you work, so your developers also operate and also maintain the code that they build, then Kubernetes is a really good way to automate your whole infrastructure. And that gives you a lot of advantages, mainly for developers, that they can really focus on the development. And yeah, for your organization, it has so many benefits from a technical perspective. That's why you sometimes see Kubernetes growing from developers, because they love it so much. And I think for Kubernetes in an organization to thrive and to grow, developers need to be your advocates. So you should really have a good Kubernetes setup. And developers should be able to focus on the development, and that is the way that they can produce results, better results, faster, which is actually a business item.
Yeah. So could I say, and that's how I've heard it, and I do think it's similar. So Kubernetes brings a new layer of abstraction, right? So it's further pushing down, I would say, infra and whatever operating system of where you need to run on, and then and then the focus becomes more and more on actual feature development, which effectively means you can bring more value to the business because teams are focused on feature development rather than a lot of infra and operations and middleware upgrades and all these type of things.
That's I believe the beautiful thing about Kubernetes. So once you implement Kubernetes, like in history, you had your developers and your operators, and you had to throw the software over a wall, and they had to maintain it, and they had to communicate. But now if you have, for example, a platform team that centrally maintains your Kubernetes stacks and implements features for the developers, then your developers don't have to worry about anything apart from development and, of course, the monitoring of the application. But there's a lot of things they don't need to worry about. Yeah. Like centralized monitoring, centralized logging, maybe SSL, load balancing, all that stuff. Yeah. And there's hundreds of things that in a traditional monolith, developers would really have to think about. Yeah. With Kubernetes, you can automate that away. You can abstract it away, just like you said, like an infrastructure abstraction layer. And that makes it for different teams to work together, but not communicate that much together, and it makes it more efficient. Yeah,
and I'm smiling because what I really see happening is, although this sounds really nice on paper, I do know that there are a lot of organizations still struggling, and you might be here in this session thinking, it's nice, right? In theory, indeed, there's an abstraction layer, but what about my developer experience? I still face a bottleneck with the platform team if I need to have access to the logs or to the metrics. I still have that paper approval to get my change out because I'm in a bank and still my compliance process hasn't changed that much. And that's, I do think, really, really important to realize as well, is that it's not, well, it's something you can achieve, right? But it really takes a lot of hard effort. And just bringing in Kubernetes without thinking about the automation, CI/CD, security, change management, you'll never get there. So that's super important. So it's the question is how do you communicate benefits? So it's you build it, you run it, right? So you really focus on autonomous teams. Yeah. That's one. Implicit, you didn't mention that explicitly, but implicitly you can go faster because you're more isolated. Whatever you develop, rather than a monolith with hundreds of dependencies, you can bring it forward yourself. And ultimately, I do think what is also important is the developer experience or the developer joy, right? Having a good workplace with modern technology is also good of being a good employer for your people.
Exactly, and there's also ways that it can fail. So you really have to set up a stack that supports the development team and works for them, not against them.
Yeah. All right. There's already one question coming in, so I'm just reading it here. Hyman, in your experience, are you seeing more multi-tenant Kubernetes clusters or smaller clusters as a service? And what are the deciding factors? And I do think it's nice to close off this section with this answer.
Yeah, that's a good point. So multi-tenancy within Kubernetes, of course, is possible. So what you see in the bigger organizations, some teams really need to be completely isolated from other teams. So it's sort of a trade-off. So whether you want your complexity to be with managing the Kubernetes clusters yourself and managing the multi-tenancy versus managing multiple Kubernetes clusters. And in a lot of situations, managing multiple Kubernetes clusters in that case is the better choice. But if you have a really good platform team with really a lot of experience with Kubernetes, then multi-tenancy is also an option. But of course, security-wise, even with multi-tenancy, the question really is how far does it need to go? So if your application cannot run on a node that another application is running on, for example, because it's the same hardware, in that case, better create two Kubernetes clusters, for example. Yeah.
So you're saying it actually depends a little bit on the skills of the people that will drive how far do you want to go. If you want to do multi-tenant, right? It's possible, but you need to be kind of a pro to make that happen. And if there are a lot of security concerns, you might want to think twice before you go all the way, or rather have it just separate. And what I know from my own practice is it's relatively simple these days to just spin up a cluster in a super repetitive way, right? So it's although there's so much automation around it, that approach and also the monitoring of it, compared to 5 years ago, becomes more and more just a good way of handling it.
Yeah, and one way to think about too is if you have 10 different development teams that are all managing their own cluster, that becomes a danger in itself. Because if I strongly believe that developers should not focus on implementing Kubernetes and really abstract that away from to a platform team, or maybe even a platform organization that handles the Kubernetes implementation for you. But if lead engineers, usually it's the lead engineer or the best developer, implements Kubernetes, you're wasting a lot of development resources. And sometimes people underestimate that disadvantage.
Yeah.